John, thanks for hopping on. You have a big medical background. You've even done clinical trials yourselves. And I wanted to kind of give the psychedelic industry kind of a run through with you, of course, talking about a relatively hot industry, been blowing up recently. I kind of wanted to run through some of the potential opportunities out there, but also what your views on the space are, maybe long term. What's the visionary perspective? But maybe we kick things off and kind of walk into it. The biggest part, use cases for psychedelics. You've got some here listed. That's addiction relief, and PTSD, pain, things like that. Do you want to comment on any of those sectors?
So I actually did a quick little survey of brokerage firms, and it's a sector that no one's following yet. So there is a tremendous opportunity from an infancy standpoint, because if it ever catches on fire, you're really early. So I mean, when you look at the psychedelics, it's been around for a while. It was big in the 60s, but it was more of a party drug, party usage. And it got a bad name from that standpoint. So the FDA put it in category 1 or level 1. So it's very difficult for doctors to prescribe on a consistent basis. But I took a quick survey of the industry, talked to a bunch of psychiatrists in the area. It's new to them. They're not, they haven't really followed it, and they're saying, oh, wow, this is interesting. They're starting to use it for a lot of mental health issues, or they're doing it in case studies or anecdotal use. So from a clinical standpoint, they're just starting to create the proper protocols that's required at the FDA level. And it was surprising because one, Johnson & Johnson in 2018 got approval of one of their drugs for use in the mental health space. And they were using ketamine, which, in the street use is called Special K for parties. So that was a kind of like a controversial approval back in 2018. But Johnson & Johnson, as I know, is the only major player that is in this space. There's a lot of small companies, and I guess from looking at markets, there's been quite a bit of activity in it, and a lot of it, I believe, is the rotation from the marijuana cannabis stocks coming over, because they see this as could be the next wave of interest from a market standpoint and potential new therapies coming out for treatment in mental health.
How familiar are you or were you with the 2012, give or take, era of cannabis, kind of, the big trend? Did you follow it? Were you even an investor at any point?
I was never an investor. I did see a move, but all the drivers have been coming from Canada and Europe. It's not in the U.S. U.S. is much slower to adopt and start letting the cannabis space in. And I feel it's going to be a similar situation, because if you look at a lot of the companies that trade in this space, they have an F after it, meaning a foreign security. So the disclosures are quite different from their standpoint. All the evidence I've been seeing is all pretty much what we call in the medical field anecdotal. I haven't seen a full-blown study that I think would meet the FDA standards.
Yeah, well, let's talk more on the investment side just for a sec. We'll get to the medical side.
Okay.
Investment side, obviously, more interesting perhaps for people that might watch this. So talking about 2012 cannabis, obviously a ton of people missed the wave or even took advantage of the wave, made a ton of money. A lot of younger investors obviously made a ton of money as well, being kind of ahead of the trend. I'm kind of seeing the same, right now in psychedelics. What's your take? Is that what you kind of see as the current psychedelic wave? Is, hey, try and maybe put a few horses in the race, and you're betting that psychedelics become hot? What's your take?
Yeah, as I stated earlier, it's in its infancy here in the U.S. I mean, or it should be classified as a rebirth, because it was pretty popular in the 60s, I guess, from all my readings. And then it got put on hold for the last 20 or 60 years, actually. Wow, time flies. Or 50 or 60 years. And now it's in the last year or maybe even 2 years, you're seeing a resurgence. So if you wanted to make a speculative play that you could be on a major move, a secular move, in terms of potential therapies that could be down the road, 5 years down the road, 3 years down the road, whatever, from a therapeutic standpoint, you stand the potential of making a lot of money because it's a risk reward game. You're getting in real early, and if it takes off, wow, you know, it's a pretty easy. So if you get in at 2 cents a share, goes to $2, you don't have to sell much to get your original 2 cents a share back and let the rest ride for a while.
Yeah. Well, you're seeing some companies are doing that. I mean, there was a recent one in Canada, IPO'd a couple weeks ago that went up like 6 or 7 times within the first week. I mean, it's definitely the hot space. I kind of wanted to touch on, and we'll get to the medical side after. Let's say someone who's watching this as an investor already or wants to put money into psychedelics. You obviously have a big investment background. You haven't necessarily picked a psychedelic company yet for your portfolio, but maybe let's chat about things you would look for. To give you some examples, there's some companies that are, trying to open up a clinic or saying they're going to. There's companies that even just own a website that's informing people about psychedelics. And then there's a few other cases where it's an actual company that's going through clinical trials, for addiction relief or PTSD or something like that. What would you be looking at as, potentially, what would you like the focus to be if you were investing? What would you look for?
If I was to invest, I would look at the companies that are looking to establish true clinical trials. And even if I think there was a clinic that opened up in Wisconsin, for the mental health area. Look at that because, if the process shows good efficacy, a rollout of clinics nationwide is a possibility. So I actually look for, in this case, what we call brick and mortar structural, traditional type deals of putting things together versus more speculative of a website informing or newsletters or things like that, because what is the barriers of entry there? There really isn't. I like my whole investment history, my whole history of running companies or getting involved is I look for a niche that is quite unique that somebody with more money cannot overrun. Makes more sense for them to buy us out than to compete.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I think looking at companies that are doing something like the idea, to me, cannabis was a recreational play. You were betting that cannabis, eventually became legal, and it has for the most part. That's a success, especially in Canada and a lot of states as well. That's what happened. Can I see, psychedelics, shrooms, and other types of things being, sold at a dispensary, to retail? Honestly, not really. I think the big parts sit from a medical standpoint, and that's why I think that if you're picking a horse to put in the race, you should definitely be looking for, like you said, either an actual brick and mortar already created chain that facilitates mental health and recovery, or you're looking at a company that is going through kind of the clinical trial phase.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that thesis if you're going to come into this space. And like I said before, there isn't a major brokerage firm that has coverage. One actually started coverage is Royal Bank of Canada, a Canadian group, obviously, because all these, many of these companies are traded on Vancouver, Toronto, and so on in the Canadian exchanges. A lot of these companies you're talking about.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's kind of where marijuana started too. I mean,
Yeah.
seems to be, and then it trickles its way down. Well, I think great insight from the investment standpoint. Just to throw out some numbers, obviously, there's $35 billion made annually from addiction clinics in the U.S. Whether that's for alcohol or other things. So obviously, it's a big market. If this works, there's definitely money to be made, and that's just the U.S., let alone other places in the world. Do you want to maybe comment? Do you know any of the current techniques they're using? Maybe what psychedelics could do?
Well, from what I've read, is that like for addiction and so on, usually it's a couple month process of trying to get somebody off the addiction. Using the psychedelics, they seem to be able to get them off much quicker. like 4 or 5 days, they seem to show a major drop off in the addiction.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting from that standpoint. So if they put together a true clinical trial that will meet FDA and so on, and they really establish that, that would become more of the method for treating addictions than the traditional one.
Yeah, and right now there's a few universities looking at psychedelics in clinical trials. I mean, there is a couple companies. I mean, we don't need to list any, but they are doing clinicals at like University of British Columbia, University of Victoria, some others.
Toronto too, I think, because
Toronto's
it's all in Canada. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
reading all that. It was all Canada. And there's one at Johns Hopkins actually.
yeah,
It just got funded for 17 million or something like that.
yeah. So it's definitely being looked at, and I think a big reason, potentially fueling the growth is, opioids are a huge issue in the world, not only in North America, and talking about that whole world. There's a huge class action lawsuit that's been happening. These manufacturers of opioids are getting sued in billions of dollars. And so far, they've put up, I mean, 2 or 3 billion into like addiction relief, and a big portion of that is being put into psychedelic research. Do you want to comment on anything about that?
I really haven't tracked that aspect of it, but as part of the workout for bankruptcy courts, a lot of them will require them to set aside for education or aiding in the overcoming of the opiates, because I believe I got a mental block on the pharmacy company in the U.S., but it's family owned, that was big in the opioids, and they filed bankruptcy, and the judge is working out where a lot of it has to go towards rehabilitation.
Yeah. Now, I think what would be interesting, not often, and there's really not many companies in the clinical trials phase, and to me and to a lot of other people, obviously, clinical trials pushing the medical side is the way that this space gets further down and actually becomes real. Do you want to comment? You've gone through clinical trials yourself. Do you want to comment and maybe as an insight to people that aren't familiar with what needs to happen for clinical trials for a drug to go from testing to proven? Do you want to maybe walk through the
It's
process?
actually a pretty long process. And given that this is already declared as a category level 1, it may be a longer process. So generally, your first trial, phase 1 human trials, is to prove safety. Once you establish safety, then you go into efficacy and dosing. So to determine, does this drug have therapeutic benefit over the current methodology of treatment? And then you work on the dosing. If you get that approval, then you go into the phase 3, which the protocols are different because it depends on what the FDA wants to establish. Phase 3, if you pass phase 2, the odds of you clearing a phase 3 is really high these days, not like the older days. Because back 15, 20 years ago, you pass phase 2, your odds go up of passing phase 3, but it's not like today. Today's your percentages are extremely high. And actually, a lot of buyouts occur after phase 2 is completed. Major pharma says, you established enough, we're going to give you this buyout before you actually go into commercialization because we want this. So that happens a lot. So the process can take anywhere from clearing through 5 to 10 years.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, there's actually a couple companies that are saying they're either in phase 2 or about to complete phase 2. Would those be companies you would look at and be like, this is maybe, if I was putting money in the space, this is where I would focus?
Absolutely. And, they may be getting accelerated because, like you said, there may be a need to treat the opioid addiction. And the FDA will give accelerated clearance on that. So those companies may be in those situations. So if they are, that's fantastic.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that those would be the horses I would put in the race. From an investment standpoint too, I'm sure even though you didn't invest in 2012 cannabis, do you want to talk about some of the things not to do, perhaps, because there's a lot of people that got into the cannabis kind of investments, put a bunch of horses in the race that honestly they shouldn't have from the beginning. Do you want to maybe talk about how similar that is potentially in psychedelics? It's a hot space. It's definitely where people are moving from cannabis to psychedelics and trying to, stay trending. How would you identify companies that are just, in the trend that are trying to capitalize on it and sell stock from the companies that are actually trying to do something? What advice would you give us?
Well, one of the major things is look at their 10K report, see what cash on hand is, and see where they're at in terms of what kind of product they're trying to move out into the market. And then you got to judge, do they have enough cash to get to the product to the market, or they don't? You also look at when they release news, is the news really tangible news, or it's just news to get people to stay interested in the stock, and then they're looking to file, an S1 to sell stock to raise money, or there's a lot of clues to look at. But if you're staying with quality companies that have strong cash position, you'd be able to get to where they manufacture products. So if I was investing in some of these companies, I would talk with management, or at least their investor relations person to start with, to say, okay, this is your cash position on hand. What is your plan to bring additional cash in to be able to fulfill your product getting through the various phases of the FDA, or if they got more of a therapeutic type situation where they're providing clinics to rehabilitate. That's a different story, where they're providing all kinds of treatments, using psychedelics.
Yeah. Is there anything, you mentioned team, you mentioned management teams before. Is there red flags that would maybe set you off from the team? But is there also, on the opposite, is there things you look at and you go, oh, this is great? When you see a bunch of board members from cannabis, is that to you a red flag, or is that to you, okay, well, they've been in the industry kind of pushing a new thing? I guess there's two sides to it. Or would you rather see, doctors that, deal with addiction and have dealt with going through clinical trials? What would you be looking for?
So coming from the medical side, I'm used to seeing doctors and operating people that sit on boards and management that have and know what they're doing. You can tell somebody if they have a good handle on the industry, how it's going, by having conversation. It's more important having the doctors and having the operational people that know how to run a business properly versus somebody that went on a board of that were on the board of directors of a cannabis company, and then they sold their stock to come into this. I think that's a red flag for me personally.
Yeah. No, I think so for sure. I mean, it's tough. It's a great market. It reminds people of cryptocurrency as well. Recent trend. Not saying it's dead, but there's a lot of people that try to just throw blockchain or try to throw this, throw that, and get into the space. And it's, well, how do you pick between people that are just trying to get involved in the trend and make money in the wave versus people that are actually trying to do something? And I think that's the biggest mindset that you have to have while picking companies is, okay, wait, is this really just a marketing company that's in the space, or is it a company actually trying to create a product?
Yep. Well, just like the SEC's memo out to everyone is that when COVID happened, everybody started getting into COVID therapy, testing, and treatments, and they says, hey, we're going to come out and enforce, really come down and crack down on all these companies because they're using the COVID just to be able to raise money, just to be able to run their stock. So, there were companies that had no reason being in COVID, totally not different. Next thing I know, this is, oh, we just signed a partnership with this company and we're going to start looking at treatments. And, we did a small clinical, and we believe our product is better than Remdesivir, or Gilead's. And I saw that press release and I'm going, hold it, these guys have no doctors on the thing that have any expertise in this area. They have 2 pediatricians in a totally different field in the medical area, and they're telling me they got an equal product to remdesivir. So and their stock really did run up from like $2 to 14.